Good day and welcome back to the Ottawa History Hub podcast. Last week, the future site of the nation's capital was being circled by new settlers, largely by refugees and the children of refugees, from the newly untethered United States of America. Settlers were arriving in Upper Canada, west of Ottawa, in the future Nepean Township, south of Ottawa, in the future Rideau Township, and east of Ottawa, in the future Ottawa District. Today, we're going to be crossing that river into Lower Canada, into the future Hull Township. The settlement of Hull, Aylmer, the Gatineau, as well as the navigation infrastructure to pass the waterfalls and the rapids of the area, were the result of many people whose names have disappeared in time. No individual was more responsible for the economic, social, and political life of early Hull than the Massachusetts farmer and entrepreneur Philemon Wright. Before we step into that story, we do have to mention our chronology so far. Up until now, we've managed to tell a pretty linear story. This happens, then this happens, then something else starts and ends. Now, we're entering a period of overlapping stories. In our last episode, we learned about the Stevenses and the Honeywells coming north up the Rideau Valley in 1809 and settling in the area that would eventually become Ottawa. They were an extension of the story of the Loyalist migration. But across the Kitchissippi, Philemon Wright and his brood had been there for almost a decade. Now we're going to tell their story, which overlaps with many other stories, including the War of 1812, the arrival of Colonel John By, and the construction of the Rideau Canal, the founding of Bytown, the abolishing of slavery, the rebellions of 1837, all of which deservedly have their own episodes planned. The plan going forward is that the episodes are going to be themed stories with beginnings and endings, which are largely told chronologically, but there will be some overlap. The other option would be to tell the story year by year, covering different areas in each episode. I've decided that this would be too much like watching reruns of the news, so I'm going to tell more episodic stories, which can be more self-contained. This means that you don't have to remember the many moving parts, and I hope that you agree with this choice. Philemon Wright was born in the British colony of Massachusetts Bay, in the farming community of Charleston Village, now called Woburn, in 1760. You would think he might be too young to have served in the American War of Independence, but you'd be wrong. At the age of 15, he joined the rebel patriots and fought in the siege of Boston. A high death toll and rapid recruiting had him promoted to corporal, then sergeant before his 18th birthday. That comment sounded a little snide, that I was implying that his rise in the ranks was due to the happenstance of the war. By any standard, Philemon Wright was an ambitious, industrious, and tireless human being. While I don't have access to any of his performance in the Continental Army, if his behavior later in life was consistent with his behavior earlier in life, then I'm sure he'd have been a superstar. Philemon served 2 years in the Continental Army before leaving as a sergeant in 1777. The war would continue for another 4 years, but the militia in which Wright served only required 2 years of active soldiery before stepping back to reserve status. Like many others, he was eager to return to his farm, as the single greatest threat to most people at the time was not the arbitrary rule of kings nor the uncouth imprudence of local governance. It was deserters, looters, and bandits. The Venn diagram of those three is pretty close to a perfect circle. So, our protagonist, the 17-year-old grizzled veteran, returned home, married, and started producing an eventual count of 8 children. 2 weeks after Philemon was born, his cousin Abigail Wyman, née Wright, gave birth to a daughter, also called Abigail, who would eventually marry Philemon and become, as her mother once was, Abigail Wright. They were first cousins once removed, which at the time was not considered verboten. They were also cousins to the future second president, John Adams, and the Wymans were one of the richest families in New England. Child number 3, also called Abigail, died sometime before her 6th birthday, and child number 6 inherited the family name, also to be named Abigail. This is one of those conventions of the time which would raise eyebrows today about the mental health of a grieving parent, but it's not unheard of in other parts of the world. Land was expensive in Woburn, and Philemon would have traveled to Boston to sign documents, as well as visit a general store which would have enough stock for the running of a farm. It was on one of these trips to the big city in 1796 that he met a judge named Jonathan Fassett of Vermont, who was involved in land speculation and dealing in Lower Canada, and had just come into a deed to survey and administer half the townships of Hull, Ripon, Grandison, and Harrington. This could all be Philemon's for the low price of £600. That's the equivalent of 119,636 Canadian dollars and 92 cents today. Certainly a lot of money, but for someone as industrious and entrepreneurial as Wright, would be well worth it to secure a loan to get that much. Then, of course, Fassett needed a few extra fees to finalize the deal. You know, closing costs, clerk fees, municipal tax, and the like. Wright paid an additional £1,400, or $279,158.82 in modern Canadian dollars. Then, fun fact, it turns out that Fassett's land grant had actually been revoked, and he had no right to sell anything. Fassett then disappears from our story, though the honorable judge and dishonorable land speculator would go on to serve 4 single terms in the Vermont House of Representatives. Wright petitioned the Crown for the grant to the whole township of Hull once the skullduggery was brought to life. He ended up with a grant to survey and disperse land for about a quarter of the township, or 82,429 acres. That's 33,358 hectares. Not what he had been promised, nor what he had paid for, but certainly enough to live a comfortable life. Definitely more than the 75-acre Wright farm in Massachusetts. I'd like to make a quick note here about what makes Wright typical and atypical of the colonists at his time. What makes him typical is that he set out for a piece of land that had been claimed, and he would then survey, divide, and subdivide for incoming future immigrants. He was leaving New England, heading to a township without people, a glass waiting to be filled. What was atypical is that he was not a loyalist. He had fought in the American War and earned honors therein, but fighting on the other side. His neighbors would perhaps not be the most welcoming, but the Ottawa region was, to put it mildly, sparsely populated at the time, so his nearest neighbors would be out of sight and out of mind. The Wrights traveled to Montreal in the winter months of 1800. First to Montreal in February, then westward with his family, plus 33 axemen, 14 horses, and 8 oxen. Settlement was not a solitary endeavor, but a planned group activity. They started off walking through the rough wilderness of southwest Quebec, but on the advice of an Algonquin guide, moved on to putting their sleds on the frozen river and traveling over the flat ice, where they made much better time. To me, that sounds foolhardy and could have ended so badly, but thankfully for them it didn't. And they arrived at the point where the Kitchissippi, the great river, met the Negatinong-Zibi, first gallicized as Gatineau, then Gatineau, and today reverted to Gatineau. The Wright party made their landing at what's now Point de Gatineau and began setting up the Gatineau farm, including a log cabin that they called the Wigwam on the northwest corner of where the Gatineau flows into the Ottawa. A few days later, as they had begun felling trees, they were met by a group of Algonquin from up the Negatinong. They were curious as to why this band of white settlers were on Algonquin land, cutting down trees, frightening away the wildlife, And why did they look like they were expecting to stay for some time? Wright had paid for the land multiple times at this point, and was quick to produce a document from the government in Quebec City attesting to Wright's claim on the land. The Algonquin insisted that this was not Lower Canada's land to give away. Cooler heads prevailed, a rare event in the history of colonialism, and they agreed to consult the Land Management Office in Montreal for confirmation. And if the Algonquin claim to the land superseded Wright's, then he would pay for the land, and if not, then they pledged to be good neighbors. As it turned out, the Mississaugas of the St. Lawrence and the Ojibwe of Georgian Bay had surrendered the land of the north shore of the Ottawa on behalf of the Algonquin in order to secure their own territory around Tyendinaga and Grand River. Nobody had bothered to tell the Algonquin this, as they were in Lower Canada, and the Ojibwe and Mississauga were in Upper Canada. In the 2 years that this took to be sorted out, the Wright community were actually good neighbors. Abigail Wright was a skilled nurse who helped to treat the sick of both communities, and the Wright community would facilitate trade runs downriver to Montreal. This was a recurring theme in the white Indigenous relationships in the Ottawa area, not violence, but grudging acquiescence to the greater powers by the diffuse Algonquin communities. Wright was an experienced farmer, and he determined, correctly, that the Pointe de Gatineau site was indeed a good site for a farm. The land was on the river and was flat enough for easy irrigation and high enough to avoid flooding, which you may recall from our first episode on the Champlain Sea, was to be an endemic problem in the Ottawa River basin. As an independent farmer, Philemon had to be an agricultural and commercial polymath. He was aware of commodity pricing in the markets of British North America and New England. He knew how to build and operate a mill to convert his grain into flour, something that would be easier to transport and sell at a greater value. He understood the principles of blacksmithing well enough that he wouldn't need to be constantly sending away to Montreal whenever something broke. He also had a knack for identifying opportunities. A few kilometers west of the wigwam was the end of the navigable Ottawa River. The Chaudière Falls were impassable to any of the shallow draw boats or bateaux that sail up the river to trade. Any further past there would have to be done by canoe, as had been done during the time of Étienne Brûlé 200 years ago. That worked fine for the fur trade, as fur was a small and light commodity, easily transported by canoe. Philemon saw the open forests and knew the value of lumber. This commodity could be brought to market if there were a way to work around the falls, which would make a fantastic hub for east-west transit on the river. The plans to construct portages and canals around the falls to open up the lumber resources of the Ottawa Valley is what gave birth to Wright's idea of a town, which he called Columbia Falls. Nobody else called it that. Everyone in the Ottawa Valley Trade Network would simply refer to it as Wrightstown. Philemon's philosophy of building a town was different from that of the Crown. The Crown believed that if you designated a territory as a town, then people would populate it, and a town eventually it would become. Wright believed that if he built the infrastructure, people would come, and was fine to let the Crown surveyors quabble about where the town should go. He would build, people would come, and Columbia Falls would become a beacon of the West. This would be considered Western Canada at the time, with apologies to Alberta. Columbia Falls would become a hub for travel up and down the Ottawa, with laborers facilitating the portage around the falls and the infrastructure to host people accompanying the trade, including warehousing, a hotel called the Columbia, and both a brewery and a distillery. A grist mill would be built to convert grain into flour, sawmills to convert felled trees into lumber, and, most importantly, a slide to move material from the upper river to the lower. The first few years were predictably difficult, with a constant flurry of activity, not limited to the regular labor of farming, but building farm infrastructure from scratch and trying to establish a commercial presence in a near-empty wilderness. The enterprise of Wrightstown was perennially on the verge of bankruptcy. Then, in a land far, far away, a convoluted series of events led to an even more convoluted series of events called the Napoleonic Wars. This war, or more accurately a series of wars, separated by a great sea, had a huge impact on the landlocked and peace-ridden Wrightstown. Britain needed ships for war, and for ships she needed lumber. She needed long logs for ships, with short staves for barrels of rum, both being equally important for the participation in Europe's most violent conflagration since the 30 Years' War, almost 2 centuries past. Life in Wrightstown was seasonal. Spring was for planting and sowing, summer for maintaining, digging, and building, and fall for harvesting and exporting to market. The long, dark Canadian winters ran the risk of running into seasonal alcoholism, depression, and danger if people were not busy. So this became the season of felling trees. Lugging trees through the mud of spring was more difficult than sliding them over the snow, so this worked out fine. The frozen river meant that bringing logs and staves down to the lower reaches of the river was easier without the need for a drastic portage. The logs would be brought to the frozen waters of the mouth of the Gatineau River and tied together with rope, so that when the water melted, the lumber wouldn't simply float away. In June of 1806, Philemon and his 17-year-old son Tiberius built a raft and christened it the Colombo, then prepared to bring the logs downriver to Quebec City for sale to British shipbuilders who were in the heady afterglow of the Trafalgar victory a year before. Philemon, Tiberius, and 3 business associates, including a free person of color by the superlative name of London Oxford, the first black person to live in the Ottawa Valley, came with Wright from Woburn in 1800. They left Wrightstown and went burling down and down white water. That's where they learned to step lightly. I can guess what you're wondering. How long does it take to row a raft with 5 people and keep track of 700 logs and 6,000 barrel staves? Well, they left 11 June and arrived in Quebec City on 12 August. So the answer is 62 days. As a farmer, Wright made more than enough for he and his family to live comfortably, though bringing foodstuffs and cash crops like hemp to market was always a challenge. Lumber was the key to financial stability for Wrightstown. With the liquid capital it provided, he could purchase his own light bateaux and carry goods to market, and not pay Montreal porter prices. He was well on his way to paying back the bank the initial startup costs for his settlement. He was the most successful farmer in the Ottawa Valley and the most successful lumber baron. 2 of the key constructions to Wrightstown at this time were the dam and the slide. The dam created a calm water flow next to the waterfall, and the slide was a hazardous wooden canal system to bring the lumber from its float in the upper Ottawa down to the calmer waters of the lower Ottawa, where the raft caravans could muster and bring them to market in Quebec. The slide would not come close to passing an occupational health and safety inspection today, and would typically kill 2 people per season. When the war came to an end, the market for lumber began to die down. The ever-sociable entrepreneur met a British officer stationed across the river at the mouth of the Rideau River by the name of Colonel John By. Colonel By was an engineer charged with building a system of locks, canals, and secure waterways from Kingston all the way to the Ottawa River. During the War of 1812, the British holdings in the Great Lakes got a reminder that all their trade passed through the St. Lawrence, and was quite susceptible to American interference from the South Shore. This canal system would allow for trade to turn left at Kingston and avoid trading along the border of a potentially belligerent America. A logical plan, but it unfortunately would have to import cement from Kingston and Montreal, both very far away. Cement is made from ground limestone, clay, and sand, and is then heated in a rotating kiln. It's more complicated than this, but we're talking history, not construction. The area around Wrightstown was chock-a-block full of sand and clay and limestone. So the entrepreneurial Wright saw the opportunity to incorporate the Wright & Sons Cement Company. On 26 September 1826, by Wright, John McTaggart the engineer, Thomas Mackay, the master stonemason who would become the founder of New Edinburgh, and John Redpath, master stonemason who would found Canada's largest sugar company, met in the dining room of the Columbia Hotel for an early working luncheon. By needed cement to complete the slide of the Rideau Canal, and he needed laborers to do it. Wrightstown had a population of around 1,000, most of whom worked for Wright. They haggled over pricing and deadlines for a couple of hours, and agreed that there would be work camps built to the east of the canal site. These would coalesce and form Lower Town. There would eventually be a garrison atop of the hill next to the canal site, on what would be called Barracks Hill, and later Parliament Hill. In the meantime, Wrightstown would host the garrison. There would be infrastructure built and a new village to the west of Barracks Hill, in what would come to be called Upper Town. The transportation of cement across the river would be problematic, as cement is heavy, so the masons Mackay and Redpath and the engineer McTaggart would need to construct a bridge connecting the canal work site in the future Ottawa with the quarries, taverns, distilleries, brewery, dock, rooming houses, and granaries in Wrightstown. In that afternoon, Wright & Sons Cement Company, working in tandem with the Wright & Sons Lumber Company, began laying the groundwork of the Union Bridge, actually a series of 3 bridges, island hopping across the river at the Chaudière waterfall, where the Chaudière crossing is today. This date would also represent the founding of Bytown. Bytown wouldn't officially incorporate as a town until 1 January 1850, theoretically lasting only 5 years until 1 January 1855, but 26 September 1826 would mark the founding of the settlement, regardless of when the incorporation documents were issued. The widespread production of cement also allowed for the conversion of Wrightstown from a city of wood to a city of stone. The town already had a grist mill, a hemp mill, a sawmill, 8 lime kilns, a steamboat landing, a brewery, a distillery, and Philemon's own mansion, named the White House, after Wright's American home's most famous palace. Wright was also involved in all aspects of life in Hull that he earned the nickname the Old Squire. He was a leader in farming, cement, construction, lumber, the lucrative awarding of government contracts, and the different Freemason clubs from Aylmer to Hawkesbury. Despite a past of fighting with the Americans against the Crown, it was natural for him to be elected the representative to the Lower Canada legislature in 1830. He voted against the 92 resolutions of Louis-Joseph Papineau, which would seem surprising as someone who had sided with those advocating a greater local autonomy from the Crown in his own native Massachusetts. Young men and old men have different politics, and an old man who was among the richest in 2 colonies would seem to have a conservative bend to defend those privileges. He would die on 3 June 1839, a month after the first telegraph and when Charles Goodyear first vulcanized rubber. He had flourished in a changing world, but that world had not stopped changing around him. Despite not being a resident of what would become Ottawa, he worked with names like John By, Nicholas Sparks, Bradish Billings, all of whom have their names on streets across the city. And Andrew Leamy, of Leamy Lake fame, married Ericssona Wright, Philemon's daughter. Philemon Wright High School is one of the few Anglophone schools in Gatineau. Wrightsville is a neighborhood in central Gatineau. Wright shared a blood relation with every U.S. president, with the two exceptions of New Yorkers Martin Van Buren and Donald Trump. Thank you for listening to this biographical episode of the Ottawa History Hub. This show is written, recorded, and produced by myself, Brendan Ray. I hope that you've been enjoying it. If you did, please subscribe and leave a review or rating where you got this. You can learn more about Philemon Wright and his time on the website, ottawahistoryhub.com. And if you'd like to message me, you can reach me at ottawahistoryhub@gmail.com. You can follow the show on Facebook and Blue Sky at Ottawa History Hub, or on X Twitter at OttHistoryHub. Next week, we'll be starting a two-parter on the War of 1812, which both started and ended midway through this episode. So we're going to rewind a little bit to do it more justice. Until then, advance Ottawa, en avant!